I went to a Dutch-American symposium at New York Society for Ethical Culture on October 6-7, 2019. The symposium was called Humanism Across the Atlantic, Looking for Common Ground. At this symposium, Professor Joachim Duyndam made a presentation on humanism and resilience. In his presentation, he talked about resilience, forgiveness, and courage.
The four of us, you have heard already, Peter Derksen, Anja Magilsen, and Marieke van der Doel. We form, with quite some other colleagues, what we call the chair group. Well, that's a research group and also responsible for the education at the University of Humanistic Studies. It's called now Humanism and Philosophy. That's also my leeropdracht, Humanism and Philosophy, and it will rapidly be changed in Humanism and Social Resilience. So we think that Humanism and Social Resilience is a better, more encompassing name of the group. So my talk aims at understanding how resilience can be enhanced through the inspiration given by exemplars of resilience and other values. How can, for instance, Nelson Mandela, through his embodiment of and living up to courage, forgiveness, spiritual strength, make others courageous, forgiving, and spiritually strong? Inspiration, such as Mandela's, applies to both individuals and groups, not only the black South African people, but also families, churches, companies, leaders, etc., empowerment movements worldwide. This paper takes a systemic approach. It attempts to understand inspiration, like Mandela's, as a transference of resilience from one system to another, from one life in its context, Mandela's performance during and after apartheid, to other individual and joint lives in their possibly quite different contexts. The systemic approach of understanding resilience in this paper is conducted from a humanist perspective, building on the resilience research at the University of Humanistic Studies. I will first explain the roots of resilience in the humanist tradition, in the Dutch humanist tradition. And I will explain how I understand humanism as a tradition rather than as a doctrine or a fixed set of values. As a tradition, humanism operates as a movement of passing on, that is, finding, reinterpreting, applying to new contexts of meanings, values, ideas, practices, in a critical relationship to existing views, opinions, and practices. In which movement the critical is for the state of humaneness. Hence, I can argue that humanist traditions can be articulated and understood through exemplary people, sometimes called role models, who represent or embody this applying of humanist values. These may be thinkers, scientists, activists, artists, practitioners, politicians like Mandela, who can be considered to be part of and representative of humanist traditions. From this basic understanding of how inspiration works, it will be demonstrated how resilience is hermeneutically transferred from the exemplar to the individual and joint moral agents we all are, making us all more resilient. So first, the Dutch humanist tradition. The Dutch humanist tradition of resilience owes its origin to its founding father, Jaap van Praag. When hiding during the Second World War, to which he was forced being a Jew, he started wondering how things had managed to get in such a terrible state that so many people felt so hopeless that it proved to be susceptible to the temptations and the false promises of Nazism in the 1930s. He concluded that this state of affairs had come about because most people were lacking in the resilience required to resist such massive enticements. In Van Praag's view, the reason for this lack of resistance lay in their absence of a clear outlook on life, a dearth of moral principles for them to cling on to, compounded by non-existence of a motivating inspiration to guide them. In short, they lacked a philosophy of life. The absence of a philosophy of life, for Van Praag, this equals nihilism, makes people susceptible to current delusions, particularly if these are mass delusions. For that matter, it made no difference to Van Praag in principle whether this philosophy of life was Christian, humanist, or sprang from another religion or aim or worldview. By organizing philosophical humanism after the war, Van Praag was aiming at developing a broad, open philosophy of life that will be amenable to agnostics, non-believers, as well as to people with religious beliefs. With the promotion of resilience in mind, he chose to revitalize humanism in this broad sense. Van Praag not only developed humanism as a philosophy of life or life stance in a contemplative, theoretical sense, deriving humanism back to Renaissance humanists, but he also contributed to the building of a practical humanism, including humanist chaplaincy. The idea of resilience that Van Praag developed is quite different from current conceptions of resilience. I'm not going into that too deeply, but resilience is now a very booming concept, and it's applied in all contexts of assistance, help, youth with problems, elderly with problems, etc. So you can say the current conception of resilience is linked to all kinds of adversity. It's for people with problems. But in Van Praag's vision, the resilience is for everyone. It's for everybody, not only for people with problems. For everybody is very important. Actually, you can distinguish three kinds of opposites of resilience. The adversity I just mentioned, the general vulnerability of human life, like you can always get a disease or the human mortality and things like that. And very special, the third opposite of resilience, to resist all kinds of pressure, cultural pressure, peer pressure, mass pressure, media pressure, market pressure, and all those pressures that we are subject to today. So, and then I come to this long definition of resilience. It's the creative ability, dependent on one's individual and social situation, first, to endure vulnerability, just mentioned, or second, to recover from adversity, and three, to withstand heteronomous pressure. I call this heteronomous pressure, and I will confront it with an autonomous response to this heteronomous pressure. By creatively responding to this vulnerability, adversity, and heteronomous pressure, and by that, to uphold a relative fitness and relational autonomy in thought and action in oneself and others. As a key virtue, resilience is part of a meaningful life directed at the humane society. This was also mentioned this morning by Anja Magielsen. This is part of the research program of the university. So the humanist tradition, we have already heard from Marieke that humanism was founded, no, it's not founded, but it originates from since Renaissance. One could also defend that it originates from antiquity. And you can say there's the great humanist tradition running from Renaissance, Enlightenment, 19th century, like things like Bildung, into the 20th and 21st century. I will not get into that because we heard already a lot about that. I will just state that humanism is not only this big tradition in Western history, but you can also distinguish smaller humanist traditions. And the first of them, that's the humanist essay tradition. I had a PhD student who wrote a dissertation on this subject. He defended that the essay is a typical humanist genre, and he was very much interested in the Dutch essayist Rudy Kousbroek, and he traced him back to the 19th century Dutch novelist Multatuli, which is a pseudonym. His real name is Eduard Douwes Dekker, and to Montaigne in the 16th century, who is generally recognized as the founder of the genre of the essay. By saying that the essay is a humanist genre, I don't want to claim that every essay is humanistic or whatever. There are also many other essays, but the essay as an intermediate between fiction and non-fiction, with a personal stance, with a critical intention, etc. A lot more to say about this. I think you can defend that the essay is a humanist genre and that there is something like a essay tradition. There's not one essential quality to define the essay. The genre can be circumscribed by a family, a resemblance of qualities: critical, open, argumentative, truth-seeking, examining, creative, morally interested, etc., etc. So that's about the essay. It's ironic, humorous. Another significant and quite different example of a humanist tradition is to be found in today's Black humanism movement. The Black Humanist Alliance fights against devaluation of black lives, white privilege, and racism, widespread in today's Europe and America. In their commitment to realizing social justice for all, they resume the humanist tradition of emancipation, empowerment, and intersectionality, a tradition that aims at dignity and respect, comprising humanists in this context. The struggle is being conducted by means of critical reason, ethics, free inquiry, and self-determination. Black humanism is also rooted in the history of the African-American community in the United States. African-American humanists, including Dubois, Hubert Harrison, I found a few more, A. Philip Randolph, Carter Woodson, Rosa Parks, and of course our own Tony Pinn. They have made significant contributions to history, literature, human rights, science, and activism. Today's Black humanism movement can profit from the heritage of this Black humanist tradition to better understand current problems and devise solutions. And vice versa, the entire humanist movement can learn from the Black humanist tradition. For example, the fallacy of all lives matter versus Black lives matter, discussed by Tony Pinn. So these are the two examples of, well, you can say, not those big, great historical traditions, but quite recent, but very important, interesting humanist traditions. But what do we understand by humanist tradition? What is a tradition? Now that we have seen that humanism can be understood as a tradition, including the greater and the smaller traditions, and before turning over to the exemplary persons embodying humanist traditions, we first have to pay attention to what humanist consists of, its substance, so to speak. And I will discuss this only very briefly. Humanism, I take as a critical cultural tradition that uncovers and interprets sources from that culture, if this is necessary for the humaneness of this culture. So humanism has its own views on humaneness, but it claims no monopoly on it. Humanism's critical stance implies that humaneness is continually rediscovered, reassessed, and defended in a dialogue with other domains of culture: literature, arts, philosophy, worldviews, and also religions. Today, the notion of humaneness is challenged from at least two different sides. From the research into the moral capacities of other animals, like apes and elephants, among others conducted by Frans de Waal, very famous Dutch American, and, on the other hand, from the development of robotization, as it is brought forward by Yuval Noah Harari, who predicts that humans, at least most humans, will become superfluous when robots will have taken over the world. Do you know that book, Homo Deus, Harari? It's very interesting. It's really a challenge of humanism. You know it, Philip, I know. So, and now I come to the core. I will argue that learning resilience, according to our problem statement, learning resilience is achieved through hermeneutically relating to exemplary people representing and living resilience. The systemic way this learning is done in the humanist tradition can be clarified through its hermeneutical character. Both the way ideas, meanings, and values are passed on in humanist traditions, from cultural sources to present-day context, and the way we relate to humanist traditions through exemplary humanists, both are hermeneutical. So let me first briefly explain the concept of hermeneutics and then move on to the exemplary persons. The term hermeneutics refers both to the art and the theory of interpretation. Hermeneutics originated in antiquity. In its classical sense, it is particularly concerned with religious and legal texts. The name hermeneutics derives from Hermes, the messenger between the gods and the humans. Interpretation in relation to tradition means that what is taken from the source should be translated from the source's context to the present-day context of the interpreter. The source can be anything, a work of art, a book, a story, a life narrative, but the paradigm of hermeneutical interpretation is the interpretation of a text. Hermeneutical interpretation is directed at the meaning or the meanings of the text, which is usually not obvious, but partly clear and partly hidden. The interpretation proceeds by negotiating meanings between interpreter and text. Negotiating meanings can be imagined as being moving backwards and forwards between debating readers and texts in the process of reconstructing meaning, in what the hermeneutic philosopher Gadamer labels the hermeneutic circle, involving a flux of hypothesis forming, testing, adjusting, and testing once again. The meanings that then materialize are not purely objective, as if all we had to do was simply dig them out of the text, but they are also not merely subjective, as if the reader or interpreter could extrapolate the meaning from the text to suit oneself, as if the process were simply seeing in the text only what was already in the reader's mind. The meaning is the result of a wrestling interaction and debate between readers and text. Not only is the interpretation itself a matter of moving between contexts, as we stated already, but obviously the interpretive process as such always happens in given contexts, in historical, cultural, economic, political contexts, and ongoing debates. Moreover, a hermeneutic reader has a vested interest in the meaning or he or she wants to negotiate. Equally, in the classical hermeneutics of authoritative religious scriptures and legal texts, great importance is attached to knowing what the gods meant or what the law prescribes. This important aim demands honesty and respect for the text. A hermeneutic interpreter cannot just change or ignore parts of the text with good reason. Okay, so far. This brief introduction to hermeneutics helps us to understand the way humanist tradition works, including our own relation to it. Hermeneutical interpretation is not just the way that is not the way that the humanist tradition works, it's also the way that we relate to it. I already said that. To explain our relation to humanist tradition, I now focus on the role of exemplary people in humanist traditions. One significant way in which ideas, values, and meanings are passed on in humanist traditions is through exemplary people who embody or demonstrate or live these values, meanings, and ideas. Resilience may not be only one of these values or ideas. Resilience as such is transferred from the exemplar to moral agents by the way the agents relate to the values and ideas demonstrated by the exemplar. Unlike most worldviews, such as Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, humanism seems to underestimate the importance of its exemplars. Here are some examples. These are of course, the famous moral heroes, Mandela, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. These are some particular examples of mine. And these are also, famous people. Most of them you will recognize. This is the girl that sailed from Europe to America for the climate.
She'll be here on Monday.
Great. This is a famous conductor I like very much. That's John Lennon. And that's the German liberation theologian Dorothee Sölle. As I said, humanism seems to underestimate the importance of its exemplars, among whom I would list Socrates, Erasmus, Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, Immanuel Kant, George Eliot, which is a pseudonym of Mary Ann Evans, Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, and Nelson Mandela. Speaking generally of exemplary people, we might perhaps first think of the moral heroes. Humanist models don't have to be such well-known people. We all have experienced coping with a bewildering situation by following the example of a wise friend, or have been moved by someone's authentic behavior. These are not at all unusual experiences. To grasp the hermeneutical character of being inspired by exemplars, both the great and the smaller exemplary people, it's best to distinguish this kind of inspiration from mere imitation. In our present-day culture that highly values authenticity, imitation is held in disrepute. On the other hand, without our capacity to imitate, we could not learn anything at all, from walking and speaking to playing the piano and conducting scientific research. However, according to the so-called mimetic theory of René Girard, here you have him, imitation is principally dangerous. By imitation or mimesis, Girard does not refer to the copying or mirroring of someone's gestures or behavior, but to the imitation of someone's interested relation to the world, particularly someone's desire. Mimetic desire means desiring something because someone else desires it, if only being the proud owner of the same thing. It can be my neighbor's larger car, my colleague's facelift, a new smartphone app, the smartphone itself, a fashionable holiday destination, a current opinion, or a refined taste. To me as a man, a woman becomes attractive because someone else desires her. Our longings, wishes, and aims do not arise in us as individuals, but are created, stimulated, and maintained by others, aiming to satisfy the very same longings and wishes. The other person functions as a model in our covetousness. In Girard's view, this is a very, pessimistic view on human nature. It's ruled by imitation. That's what he says. What he says, and it holds more than desires only. The interesting part comes later when I give an answer to this. But this is a very serious point. The mimetic desire holds for more than desires only. Thinking and forming opinions and emotions are equally mimetic. Some views and opinions are desirable, and if you think the same way too, you belong to us. Because the model also has a model, and so on, the mimetic mechanism is contagious. And because it is contagious, it catches on fast and takes on a popular character of its own accord. Thus, mimetic theory can explain such phenomena as consumerism, media hypes, and peer pressure. Mimetic contagiousness is demonstrable in every stakeholder relationship: thinking, desiring, acting, attributing meaning, feeling, observing. In short, everything that in phenomenology is called intentionality is mimetically transferred by way of models according to mimetic theory. I interpreted this mimetic contagiousness as a determining influence on one's will. The dangerous aspect of mimetic desire, according to Girard, is that imitating models, who themselves, of course, imitate also models, invariably leads to a crisis and often to violence. For if everyone is after the same things, by definition, these desirable things become scarce, and a struggle to own or to have control of them follows. Moreover, according to Girard, a mimetic crisis leads to the singling out and banishment of scapegoats, who, rightly or wrongly, are blamed for the crisis. The tragic conclusion of mimetic theory is that peace can only be restored through the expelling of a scapegoat. Humanism, however, can offer an answer to this seeming inevitability of mimetic desire. Let's look closer to this answering to understand how this can make the answerer more resilient to this kind of mimetic pressure. The humanist answer is based on the distinction between being hermeneutically inspired by an exemplar on the one hand, and getting infected by imitation by a model on the other. Although it's a subtle distinction between imitation and inspiration, it's of the greatest importance. The distinction is not between good and bad. Not every inspiring exemplar is good, as the moral heroes already mentioned, supposing that we can be sure at all about their goodness. Also, bad figures, ranging from those who appeal in the imagination like top criminals, right down to the notorious dictators of world history, are deeply inspiring to their followers and admirers. Inspiration is ambivalent. It can spur us on to do either good or evil. Conversely, it may be dangerous. Imitation is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, or necessarily wrong. As we said, without the ability to imitate, we would not be able to learn anything at all. And we would, as humans, not have evolved as far as we have. In order to understand the difference between the imitation of a model, in the sense of Girard, and being inspired by an exemplary person, we must first approach the model as well as the exemplary person from the way we relate to them. It makes no sense to distinguish a class comprised by the exceptional people simply according to the fact that they are inspiring. Inspiring is a relational concept and must therefore be understood through the relations between the person displaying the inspiring and the person who is inspired. Mimetic infection is also relational in this way. Well, the crux is, the relationship with an exemplary person should be fully hermeneutic, while the imitative relationship with a model remains hermeneutically deficient. It will be argued that resilience can only be transferred through hermeneutically relating to the exemplar or model. If I become inspired by an exemplary person, I am attracted by a specific meaning or value that this exemplary person demonstrates in his or her life or actions. My attention may be drawn to courage, respect, patience, forgiving disposition, or more specifically to the humanistic values mentioned earlier. I didn't mention them. Such as autonomy, responsibility, justice, solidarity, pluralism, and sustainability. The exemplary people appeal to me because of the way they behave. To be so courageous, honest, patient, responsible, and so on is how you should be. However, an exemplary person always demonstrates such qualities in a specific context. In the case of Nelson Mandela, who emerged as a black African leader during and after the rule of apartheid, this context was quite different from that of a prosperous European or American free citizen today. Nevertheless, Mandela can still be very inspiring for Europeans and Americans. Due to the difference in context, however, it's impossible for me as a European to imitate Mandela. So I must make a leap from his context to mine. In hermeneutics, translating from one context to another is called application. Originally, Aristotle formulated a virtue of practical knowledge, phronesis, for the application of what he called ethical values. Aristotle also emphasized the importance of exemplary phronimos, an exemplary wise person who demonstrates this virtue and lives virtuously. For Gadamer, already mentioned, application is the core of hermeneutics. In his major work, Truth and Method, he uses the Latin term applicatio. I sometimes prefer concretization in addition to application as a better translation in order to avoid the misinterpretation of thinking of a preconceived objective value that only has to be applied. Values are never separately obtainable, but values only emerge as a value when actually applied or concretized as a value, preferably by an exemplary person. In other words, a value only really exists in its application. And therefore the humanistic values that I just mentioned, freedom and responsibility, etc., in their general abstract wording, they are not exclusively humanistic. They could also be Christian or whatever. They are humanistic in their application, in the way that they are operationalized and autonomously applied according to humanist values discussed in the previous section. As I said, resilience may be seen as one of these values, but above all, resilience results from hermeneutically relating to the values and ideas demonstrated and embodied by the exemplar. Hermeneutically relating means applying these values and ideas to the context of the moral agent, to my own context, and as such, resilience is practical wisdom. Interpreting an inspiring relationship with an exemplary person hermeneutic, as I do here, entails in the first place realizing that the inspiring actions or behavior of the exemplary person is in itself an application or concretization of the value, even if the exemplary person does not do this intentionally or consciously or deliberately. In his actions, Mandela applied courage, and in this behavior he concretized the general value of forgiving. And this is equally true for the less famous inspirational people from our own circle of acquaintances. The way they act is also, hermeneutically speaking, an application of a value. What is now important is about the hermeneutic relation to an exemplary person is that I, as the person being inspired, do not imitate the way the exemplary person applies the value. Instead, I apply the value at stake myself. I do it autonomously, creatively in my own context. To be able to make my own application requires creativity, another element in our working definition of resilience. By creatively and autonomously performing my own application of the value that I have learned through the exemplar, I show how I am inspired by this application demonstrated by the exemplary person. And this is the difference between imitating a model and interpreting and being inspired by an exemplary person. I perform an application of my own versus I imitate the application of the other. Merely imitating is hermeneutically deficient. This has consequences for our concept of autonomy. The distinction I made between inspiration and imitation shows the important difference between having a heteronymous, contagious relation with the model and its application on the one hand, an autonomous relation to the exemplar through one's own authentic application on the other. Still, it should be noted that the distinction between a heteronymous and an autonomous relationship to an exemplar or model is not an absolute distinction, but actually a gradual one. Heteronomy comes first. In any stage of our life, we are all initially opposed to what others say, think, express, and determine. What matters is that in due course, we found our own responses to what others say, think, express. That we gradually grow from heteronomy to autonomy. Our responding means that more and more we make our own applications from the application displayed by the others, acting as models. In doing so, we are supported by humanist traditions, providing us with examples of autonomous responses to heteronymous circumstances. However, we will never be completely free from heteronomy, because autonomy is never definitively secured. The passage from heteronomy to autonomy is a balance for which we should always struggle. We all start as newborns, totally dependent on others. We all start heteronymous as heteronymous imitators. That's how we begin to learn anything. With the help of good exemplars, however, we can gain a relative, balanced and relational responding autonomy. Increasing autonomy is a development from heteronymous pressure to resilience against those pressures. And that is why learning resilience from exemplars grows by step getting more and more from heteronymously imitating applications to creatively and autonomously applying values. Moreover, it's autonomy itself that is acquired through exemplars, as it is resiliently displayed by them. Autonomy and authenticity can be truly achieved in actions inspired by model persons. The example of authenticity is paradigmatic because someone's authenticity can be very inspiring, although authenticity can by definition not be imitated, because then would it not be any more authentic. Authenticity must therefore be interpreted in the light of one's own life. The hermeneutical approach to inspiration precludes a futile opposition between a pure ideal of morally high-principled inspiration, Mandela as a modern saint, and something like a bad, depraved, mimetic desire. A hermeneutic approach begins with the recognition that we are all exposed to this mimetic contagiousness, popular trends, and group pressure. Relating resiliently to these, we may achieve relative hermeneutic freedom, given the opportunity to make our own interpretation, so we create our own application. This may all sound somewhat sophisticated, as if this whole line of thought was only suited to intellectuals and philosophers. To prevent this impression, I will end this talk by giving an example of a narrative way of hermeneutically interpreting, a horrifying example, to illustrate the concept of negotiating narrative freedom. It's taken from the exemplary resilience of Natascha Kampusch, who in 1998, as a 10-year-old girl, was abducted and kept prisoner for almost 8.5 years, gravely maltreated and violated by a paranoid and very violent abductor. Her life was spent during those 3,096 days, which is also the title of this book of hers. In 2006, she managed to escape, and in 2010 she published this book about her experiences titled 3,096 Days. She makes the impression of being relatively strong and unbroken. Despite her total dependence on only one violent man for a period of more than 8 years, she was able to give an impressive display of resilience. Regarding resilience, our focus is on the stories and fantasies that the girl told herself, partly based on the literature she knew or which she could read in her captivity, like Alice in Wonderland. My hypothesis is that her resilience stems from her powers of narration, her ability to deploy narrative imagination as a weapon for survival. She interpreted her situation with narratives. When she was 12 years old, she created her adult 18-year-old self in her imagination. And I quote, far out in front of me, I saw my 18-year-old self, being strong, self-confident and independent. My 12-year-old self moved slowly forward, while my grown-up self came towards me. In the middle, we reached for each other's hand. Her touch was warm and soft, and at the same time, I felt the strength of my grown-up self being transferred to my younger self. Grown-up Natascha embraced the smaller Natascha and comforted her, saying, I will get you out of here, I promise you that. Right now you cannot escape, you are still too small. But when you are turned 18, I will overpower the kidnapper and free you from your prison. I won't leave you alone. That night I made a pact with my own older self, and I kept my word. End of quote. This is one example of Natascha's account that shows how someone's resilience is made possible and strengthened through the interpretive power of narrative. Moreover, this example can be shown thanks to her written narrative, because the way in which we have become acquainted with Natascha Kampusch and her trials and tribulations is through her narration, through her story that she, with the help of editors, tells us in her book and in many interviews. In this way, she can become an inspiring exemplary figure for others in similar or completely different thorny circumstances. The narrative perspective also enables the power elements to become visible. The perpetrator is trying to write her life story, trying to write the life story of his victim. He's claiming the authorship of her life story. He's yanking the victim into his own macabre story. And the victim resists this in a narrative way, with success. The story of Natascha Kampusch is an example of extreme pressure being executed and one of humiliation. It's for exactly this reason that it teaches us so much about resilience, which we defined in the first section as the ability to withstand heteronomous pressure by creatively responding to vulnerability, adversity, and heteronomous pressure. And by that to uphold relative fitness and relational autonomy in thought and action. In her case, it was a struggle against intense pressure and violence. And despite all the violent attempts made by her abductor, he did not succeed in imposing his will upon hers, nor did he manage to make her his slave. She continued, for instance, to refuse to kneel in front of him and to call him maestro, as he demanded. The story of Natascha Kampusch also clearly shows the relational aspect of resilience. Just imagine, as a 10-year-old girl, she's torn away from all her relations, her parents, family, neighborhood, friends. Her relational circle was severely disrupted, and she was left with only one relationship, the one with her abductor. It was with him that she had to manage to hold out, and indeed she did. According to her report, she succeeded all that time in maintaining an open relationship with him. She tried to continue to see him, the human being in him. She knew that if she were to see him as a monster, which he was, she would not be able to endure it. In relation to him, she could try to find balance between adapting to the situation and resisting it by maintaining some equilibrium. The case of Natascha Kampusch is both horrifying and instructive as a perfect example of resilience. In fact, by her story, she has become an exemplar of resilience herself. Her story shows elements of resilience discussed in this paper, hermeneutically interpreting her situation by narratives and realizing a relative autonomy by creatively responding to heteronomous pressure. Her case is like a research laboratory situation. Everything happens in and can be demonstrated through only one relationship. The balance between autonomy and heteronomy in resilience refers to a different volition. It's the will of the other or of the will of yourself, and it's the autonomous will which is responding to the heteronomous attempts to to rule the other's rule. Crucial to humanism, I come to the end now, to the conclusion. Crucial to humanism is the notion of humaneness, as we've seen. It's not easy to describe humaneness positively and unanimously. Its meaning can vary across different periods of history and in different times. In negative sense, however, it's usually obvious when humaneness comes into play. In my view, humiliation is the most devastating opposite of humaneness. Humiliation is a relational concept, and because humans are relational beings, we cannot withdraw from humiliation, but we have to respond to it, like Nelson Mandela did and like Natascha Kampusch did. Humanism is the positive response to humiliation for the sake of humaneness. Humiliation is far more everyday business than the extreme examples suggest. By humiliation of slavishness, the humiliation of slavishness is evident due to the mimetic contagion of human will. By the term slavishness, we first think of forced labor or serfdom or whatever. But even respectable and prosperous citizens can be slaves or slavish in the broader sense of this slavishness, without even knowing it. Seen from the perspective of the will of the slave equals the will of the master. The slave wants what the master wants. In mimetic theory, this master is the Girardian model. The slavish imitates the will of his model. And because the model itself also imitates a model, and that model imitates another, and so on, they form a herd. And we form a herd. A slavish person wants what they want, what we all want. In hermeneutical terms, slavishness is the situation of imitating each other's applications. If there is one ultimate characteristic of humanism, it's the fight against slavery and slavishness, to make people resilient against slavishness. The physical slavery dealt with by human rights, and any mental slavery of the will as well. To combat this, humanism has for a long time defended the individual autonomy of the self. This is understandable, but it's not enough. Not only has this autonomy been partly responsible for leading us toward a culture of self-directedness, self-overestimation, but it has failed in particular to comprehend the susceptibility of the autonomous self to heteronomous pressure of mimesis. Today, humanism must promote resilience by defending a relational autonomy. Autonomy must be taken as relational because heteronomy, slavishness, and humiliation are also relational. We can achieve and defend relational autonomy by growing a hermeneutics-driven relational resilience to the heteronomous pressure of pressure. I hope that in this paper I have convincingly demonstrated how resilience can be acquired by hermeneutically relating to exemplary persons. That resilience in this sense must make us relatively free from mimetic pressure on our will, and that resilience makes us relatively free to live autonomously. By understanding humanism as tradition, in fact as multiple traditions, we can relate to humanist traditions and appropriate its values, ideas and practices by hermeneutically interpreting applications by exemplary humanists. Creatively apply those values to new contexts, and by that creating resilience and passing it on to future generations for the sake of humanists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joachim. It reminds me, in our Ethics for Children's program, we often talk about ethical heroes and heroines, and they can be ethical heroes and heroines for one another as well. Questions? Oh, okay, Monica.
I have some brief comments. In the U.S., this idea of resilience has become sort of like this sexy new term and a trending kind of genre, like the happiness trend, and you have all these...
I know.
So how do you work through the kind of commodification or the overdevelopment that resilience has kind of played into blaming and shaming the victim mentality? Because for a lot of people, escape is not possible, those that are survivors of certain kinds of abuses, but still live very much in a prism that is arrested to those traumatic sorts of experiences. But also, how does your concept work for those for whom are stuck within structural violence and social inequality as well? So how do we make sure that this notion doesn't get into sort of shaming and blaming, but then also doesn't come down to either a success or failure model of a person's character? And I think here of Trayvon Martin, who's become the exemplar of Black Lives Matter, but Trayvon Martin didn't make it, right? Mm-hmm. He succumbed to, his life was taken and snuffed out through a structural kind of system. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about some of those ideas a little bit.
I think I agree that resilience is like a buzzword. It's booming, and the literature is well overwhelming. It seems to be a patch for all wounds, so to speak. And so that's why I got back to the humanist tradition of Jaap van Praag and his concept of resilience, which is quite different from the current contemporary uses of the term. And the term, I touched upon it very briefly in the beginning, the term resilience nowadays is mostly applied to contexts of troubles, adversity, and all kinds of adversity. And the humanist concept of resilience is broader, and of course it also refers to adversity, but more than that. But okay, your question on blaming the victim, yeah. If the only thing you say to a victim, be resilient, and then you will manage it, that's of course not enough. But I gave the example of Natascha Kampusch of a prisoner, who showed resilience in a very situation where she couldn't get out there. She was locked up, and you saw that dungeon in which she had this small room. So, and that for a long time. And still, you cannot say to Natascha, be resilient or whatever. But she appeared to be resilient, and I was interested in how did she manage that. And therefore I focused on those narrative capacities and interpretations, on this whole hermeneutical story and of her hermeneutical framework. And I did that because this hermeneutical framework, as I explained it sounds very sophisticated and very highbrow and very philosophical. And I showed by this example that it's very common in the first place, but also to very extreme situations where you can never blame the victim, so to speak.
I really enjoyed thinking about this and different examples that you gave and other examples that I could consider. I worry that when we put people on pedestals and people develop a lot of respect and admiration for these different characters, and then information can be shared also that diminishes their stature or, questionable moral acts and things like that, like Martin Luther King, and then someone will say, well, did you know this and that and the other about this person? That some people find that very, almost traumatic, right? Even recently in kind of pro-science areas, people have strong commitments to people who are on their side and representing their values and promoting good ideas, and feel like it's very harmful if they hear accusations that about questionable moral behavior. How do we contend with that kind of thing if we think that this is a benefit to pedestalize different characters, to tell these sort of heroic stories sometimes about historical figures and current figures, sometimes I know we benefit from the fact that there was no Twitter in the time of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, right? Unfortunately, now we very much have Twitter and ways that information can spread about people who might have been valorized as heroes more in the past. I guess the question is, how do we contend with the concern that our heroes or people who we might see as exemplars are complex characters who may engage also in moral behavior that we don't think is worth valorizing them for?
Perhaps I can answer your question by saying this, that in my graduate course, I asked the students to write a paper at the end of the course on their own inspiring figure. And they have a lot of instructions to build up this paper and to make the distinctions between imitation, inspiration, all the things I just mentioned. And I also put some conditions to it, and maybe those will answer your question. In our Western culture, which is for a large part a Christian culture, is very much influenced by one ultimate exemplar, Jesus Christ. And he is exemplary for all domains of your life, which is not realistic. I mean, when I look at myself, I have other exemplars as a teacher than I have as being a father for my children or a friend to my friends. I have other inspiring exemplars on those different domains of my life. Another thing is, so the inspiration is partly, so to say, is partial. It's only one domain for my life, not total like Jesus Christ. Another thing is that an exemplar is temporary. After a few years, well, it's over, so to say. So you get new exemplars. So exemplars are far more restricted and partial than the ultimate exemplar. And especially in the case of such an, ultimate exemplar on a high stage, the risk is that he or she falls down and you get this point, etc. And that has to do with the fact that what do I know from my exemplar? What do we know from Nelson Mandela? We know some things about him, but there's much we do not know. And it's interesting that when he became very famous, Mandela, he started to give some shadow sides of his own life. He resisted the status of moral hero, of moral saint that people gave him. So he was very keen to prevent such a status, so to speak. So there are many risks, and there's lots more to say about this. For example, what's the difference between such a free relationship with an exemplar versus the fan-idol relationship, which we all know, of course, from our teenage time.
And the example of Natascha Kampusch.
Yeah.
And examples in which one looks to an actual historical figure. So she is, of course, interacting with an imaginary version of her own future. She constructs that. So to what extent, when we're dealing with actual historical figures whom we typically don't know, do we do the same?
Maybe.
Is it important there not only that we have the freedom to sort of imagine them in various ways, and there can be a kind of feedback loop as we sort of figure out how useful it is that we're imagining them in those ways, and so on and so forth. So that's the first question. The second question...
Shall I answer this first?
Okay. If you
the risk is that I forgot the first question when you put your second. The normal situation, if you are interested in a historical figure, this historical figure is known to more people than you alone. That means there's discussion about the historical figure, controversies, etc. So the chance you have to make your own historical figure, like this Natascha Kampusch in her imprisonment, is quite a different situation. I quoted Natascha Kampusch not so much as an exemplar, as well as what is resilience. And how can you be resilient in this one relationship? But so the historical figure, there is this risk of being a fan of an idol, and then try to keep the historical figure for your own. But usually you have to share those people with others.
You don't actually, because you don't actually have to find out more about them than you want to know. you can sort of be inspired, and that's that. You just don't want to learn the other stuff about them. I mean, this is a way of warding off the danger that they will be discovered to have feet of clay. But I want to ask the second question too. I mean, one concern that one might have is that in the case of Natascha Kampusch, it's very clear that there's a big heteronymous pressure. There's this guy who's trying to dominate her. And that arises sometimes in our lives, but I think, interestingly, in some of the cases that worry Monica, it's a pity she's left the room, actually the sources are too subtle. They're too invisible. So the pressure is there, and the pressure exists from structures in society, but it can't be traced causally. And one might say that so there's a social component to resilience and an individual component. Mm-hmm. You've talked about the individual component, Anya talked about the social component. One might say that one of the tasks of the social component is to help individuals understand when they are being subjected to heteronymous pressures and where those pressures are coming from.
Yes, but I think the individual is an abstraction of the social. The social is the primary situation. But sometimes you have to make this abstraction to understand, but always put it back to the social again. And also interpretations are social. I'm not making an interpretation completely of my own. I'm influenced by others. And if I'm a real academic, to make it in this context, I learn from all the other interpretations. So I'm part of a academic community when being a hermeneutical researcher, so to speak.
But black folk are living. You have no resilience is not an option. It's a survival technique for many people. I can't speak for outside of the U.S., but I say marginalized folk, not just in terms of race or ethnicity, but in terms of nationality, in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender, especially within these contexts of social protests in and around race. Hashtag Me Too, right? Like the list sort of goes on, where I think it goes back to what Debbie was saying as well. Exemplars. I've got some real issues with Gandhi. Some things he did in his life. I've got some real issues with Martin King and some things he did in his life. I have some real issues with the manner in which the United States tends to make hyper-legible Martin Luther King over and against the Malcolm X. Or the fact that Martin Luther King, there were some folk left at the bridge who were also the masterminds of that movement who aren't considered exemplars, and they were left at the bridge because of their sexuality, right? And so I just wonder, I like this idea, but I wonder how can we also create a complexity around it so we don't fall into the same conditions of existence that cause folk to have to develop resilience.
One-sided admiration, but Martin Luther King is not Jesus Christ. He's a human, so he has his faults and he has his dark sides too, like we all have.
Exactly, and that has to be brought out. That humans,
Yeah, sure. And these exemplars are also human exemplars. They're not deities. They're not godlike or whatever.
And I think you should reflect that more in the how does that impact then the definition of humanism? Humanism is not always about human flourishing, right? Humanism can be about survival, and it's complicated and it's complex, and it's not always this good and affirmative kind of thing. Sometimes humanism is bare life in a lot of ways.
Yes, I agree with you.
I'm going to talk about a different context in my own nervousness around the exemplar, because in our tradition, for example, the wives of the prophet were very often used as exemplary role models for women by not the individual creating the hermeneutic interpretation, but again, by structures of power that use, and these figures are sort of ambivalent. Yes, they are human, but they almost become semi-divine, because what we're allowed to know about them is often filtered through sacred texts or through the interpreters of sacred texts. So I often think that the exemplar is not always about resilience, but about accepting the kind of pressures that certain groups in society want you to accept because, hey, look, the exemplary figures were doing that, and these are often controlled by social structures that want to create male-female hierarchies, for example. Am I being clear? No.
What exactly is the question?
The question is, what happens when the exemplary figures are constructed
Yes.
by structures of power who don't want people necessarily to be resilient, but to adapt forms of behavior that are exemplary for women in order to make them accept, for example, their status as pious wives?
Yes, of course I agree with this case or this case that you mentioned. But I'm asking myself, does that change or does that challenge the concept of resilience and traditions, which is of course a very general philosophical frame to understand how it is possible and how it works, how this resilience works. And of course, there's survival parts. And of course, there are special, there are particular areas, and there is this construction of, what you say, this power, by powers, yeah.
Let me just say, I wouldn't consider that exemplary figures of humanism. I would consider that creations of people with their own agenda. So I don't think that would fit under something that's exemplary to look towards for humanistic behavior. I just wouldn't consider that. I mean, of course, you could create it and say, follow this because we want you to, but that's not under the heading of humanism. That's something else. You know, that's not good for human society.
The original Dutch word for resilience, the Jaap van Praag word, is in Dutch geestelijke weerbaarheid. In English translation, that means something like spiritual resilience or spiritual resistance. It's difficult to translate it. Spiritual has, for many people, a positive connotation. For me, it hasn't, by the way. But the insight I got during the research in all these matters is that spiritual resilience or spiritual resistance is something like resistance against spirits, against ghosts. And the ghost of scapegoating, for example, which is a mass movement, which is not exactly a power structure, but it happens. The scapegoating is very contagious and very dangerous. Think about the lynching and things like that. And this has to do with a spirit or a ghost of scapegoating, and being resilient or resistant to that. I think that's what it is. That's very important. And my research is now how are spirits, how are ghosts created? How do they occur? When people are together, they produce, so to say, a spirit. They produce a ghost. And this is not always good. It can be very bad and very dangerous. And resilience, spiritual resilience in the sense of Van Praag, is trying to find an answer to that and to find a breakthrough in such a atmosphere or ghost or spirit of, for example, scapegoating.
I want to make a short remark. We're talking about the dangers of exemplars, etc. But I think the important point to realize is that for movements like humanism or other large cultural traditions, the important thing is that most people don't get the tradition by theory and books, but most people get the tradition by persons. So it happens whether you like it or not. So you shouldn't talk about whether exemplars is good or not. No, it happens, and you have to try to understand it, and you have to try to canalize it in ways you would like.
Okay, let's take a little break and then we'll have the final presentation.
Okay.
you.